Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of Veritas Live. I'm your host, Anthony Cusimano, and today's episode is titled Survivalists' Guide to Cyber Threats on the Global Stage. So you know we're going to be talking all about the cyber threats and security risks that are out there, that are out to get you today. But before we talk about that, first, as always, we'd like to know, where are you from? So make sure to put in the chat where you're watching the show from today, because we want to know. And as always, if you have questions or comments, be sure to put them in the chat as well. Use the hashtag VeritasLive, and that'll bring it to our attention, and we'll try to ask them live during the show. Now, like I mentioned before, today's episode is all about cybersecurity, and we have an incredibly special guest today. So special, in fact, that there's only one guest on the show. That's right, we have retired Vice Admiral Nancy Norton here today, and she's bringing her experience from the U.S. Navy, as well as being a member of our Public Sector Advisory Board member here at Veritas. Welcome to the show, Nancy.
Well, thank you, Anthony. I appreciate you having me on, and I really appreciate being part of the Veritas team.
We appreciate you being here as well. Now, for our icebreaker, we thought we'd have a little bit of fun since you are a retired Vice Admiral and you have quite a bevy of naval experience. So I've got two for you today. The first one is, what is your favorite ship experience?
Well, Anthony, thanks. I appreciate that. I served on the USS Enterprise, CVN 65, back in 2000, 2001. And I would say that that was my best ship experience. So anybody that has ever been on board an aircraft carrier should be at awe of the amazing power and capability those aircraft carriers provide. And of course, Enterprise was the first nuclear aircraft carrier, so that makes it even more special. It was the 8th ship named the USS Enterprise. And in fact, we just laid the keel for the 9th. So Enterprise was decommissioned a few years ago. But I want you to know, the Enterprise, CVN 65, is actually even older than I am.
Wow, that's impressive. And with a name like the Enterprise, you know that there is a storied experience that goes along with that. So that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Nancy. And the second icebreaker we wanted to ask you is, we're just curious. We at Veritas Live want to know, what does it take to get a ship named after you?
Well, that's kind of a funny question. So like I said, the Enterprise has had a number of ships named the Enterprise, and they keep doing that because it's a historic name. We have battles that ships are named after, but the ship names actually come from the Secretary of the Navy. So it's up to the discretion of the Secretary of the Navy what those ships are going to be named for. There's a whole group of people who have input to that, including the Chief of Naval Operations and others. And you'll see we have different classes of ships that have different kinds of names. Some are named after cities, some are named after states, lots of different things. A lot of them are named after people. But I'll tell you a funny story. So for a long time, we had submarines that were named after fish. And they changed that. And somebody asked Hyman Rickover, the admiral who was basically the father of nuclear power in the Navy, asked him why we no longer named the submarines after fish. And he said, because fish don't vote.
That's amazing. Yeah, I can see why they would have gotten off the fish and got to something a little more political, shall we say. Well, thank you for that, Nancy. Now I feel educated and edified, and I guess we won't be getting a USS Veritas anytime soon, but fingers crossed, one can hope. Now, we got to talk before this episode last week, and you kind of blew my mind. You educated me around this topic of the global commons. It's something I'd never heard about before. And I'd love for you to share with our audience some of the information that you gave to us beforehand. So from a Vice Admiral's perspective, let's talk all about the global commons and what should everyone know about the state of the world today.
Sure. So Anthony, for you and your audience, of course, I come from the naval background. And so a lot of the perspective that I have on everything that we do comes from that, my 34-year career in the Navy. And one of the main missions of the United States Navy is to protect the global commons. And so for the U.S. Navy, that's patrolling the seas, making sure that the oceans and seas are available and free for navigation. And when you think about how interconnected the world is today, it's been that way for for decades and really a couple of 100 years, where global trade has been so vital for the development of humanity, really. And without that, with things like piracy and not being able to get to certain places, things just stop. Our interconnectedness, our global trade grinds to a halt. And you can even see examples of that when it's accidental, like, for example, when the ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, that really stopped global trade or slowed down global trade for weeks. And so that freedom of navigation of the global commons is just something that is really vital. And the more interconnected we are as a global society, the more important those global commons become. Well, what's changed in the last really 30 years or 40 years, if you think about it, is this concept of the internet and networks being part of the global commons. So cyberspace is one of the key global commons today. It carries our telecommunications, it carries our finance data, it carries our social interactions. It carries a huge part of global commerce now, because so much of the shopping that we do over the internet, those kinds of things. So cyberspace really is a vital global commons today.
It's kind of amazing to think about how, just 40, 50 years ago, the global commons were such a set concept as far as being something that was geographically bound. And by many regards, it still is, even in the sort of cyberspace version of the global commons, or the cyberspace addition to the global commons. But it shifted my mind when you told me that. And even hearing it a second time, I'm kind of in awe at the just sort of ever evolving state of the global commons. So thanks for walking me through that again, and walking our audience through that as well. Now that we understand what the global commons are, I would love to get your take on some of the recent events, as well as some of the impacts that have had on these global commons. You had I'll remind you, you had a really fun name that you shared on the pre-call. It was an acronym that meant something else to you. So what's your take on that?
Right. Well, everybody is always talking about WMD, weapons of mass destruction.
Right.
And since the late 90s, I've thought of cyberspace and cyber attacks as being WMD as well, weapons of mass disruption. So when we talk about the global commons, we talk about the kinds of disruption that can happen in cyberspace by cyberspace operations and whatever cause that might be. Those really can be mass disruptive operations or events in our world. So, one of the examples of that I think got a lot of people's attention was the Colonial Pipeline and the disruption that caused. And, you think about that was relatively small in terms of a ransomware attack on a particular company. And yet it had almost instantaneous effect on the supply of gasoline, particularly on the East Coast, but really across the board. And part of that was just because of the fear that's generated when there's a assumption that there's going to be a shortage around the globe. And so that's the kind of disruption that can happen is, you create a shortage, you create a fear of shortage. We saw that throughout COVID, of a fear of shortage in the grocery store causes people to run on toilet paper and milk and whatever else it might be. We see that in storms all of the time. And those are the kinds of disruptions in our just-in-time logistics world that we have today that can be very disruptive to businesses and to individual lifestyles and trade.
It's very interesting because it's almost it's self-fulfilling, where an attack on sort of the physical global commons can affect the digital, or vice versa, and they almost reverberate and bounce off each other and just create this sort of echo effect of negativity and fallout. It's really interesting to think about. So I'm curious, any other recent events that we should be aware of, or things that we need to think about when it comes to both the digital and the physical global commons?
Well, we see it over and over again, whether that's at the sort of international business related level, like SolarWinds attacks and all of the reverberations there, or ransomware attacks on cities and local governments, or ransomware attacks on schools and hospitals. We've seen so many of them, and certainly ransomware attacks on businesses that we hear a little bit less most of the time about those, partly because people don't want to share, businesses don't want to talk a whole lot about that, because just what you talked about, that self-fulfilling prophecy of demonstrating a lack of confidence and trust in the capability that a business has to continue to operate generates a lack of confidence and trust in a business. So there's a lot that can happen with that kind of mass disruption.
Do you feel that businesses today are becoming more prepared and ready to deal with these kind of disruptions, or is it just getting started?
Well, it's been just getting started for a very long time, but I do think that businesses are getting better. There's been a lot of effort across the board at all levels across the United States and the international community to really think through what is required in order to protect ourselves from that kind of mass disruption. So one of the focus areas that I've always had throughout my career is thinking of cybersecurity. And I've been doing this for a long time, long before it was called cybersecurity. I was doing information system security and network security back in the mid-90s. And I always think about it in terms of mission assurance. That's what my focus was for the military, was how do you continue to operate and conduct your mission, even if and when you wind up with an attack, whatever that, or an event, whatever might be the cause for that event. And so understanding more about what your operations are, what's critical, and what you need to do about it is what every level of government, state and local government, businesses, and even individuals have to do in order to be better. And I think we're seeing progress across the board. I think that the philosophy and principles of zero trust are moving us more and more in the right direction, microsegmenting our networks, reducing the kind of access levels that we give individuals, making sure that those are limited in time, limited in what parts of the network anybody or any process is able to access at any given time. And that's all really important and vital to improving our capabilities.
I love it. It almost feels like there's just multi-layer approaches that we can take as individuals, as businesses, as governments. And when we all take this seriously and work together, it sounds like we can get to a better spot.
That's exactly right.
So, and I want to, thinking on the positive, we've discussed the state of things as they are and what could be better, but as far as some recent outcomes go, both large and small, what should businesses, individuals focus on and think about for the future when it comes to these sort of cyber threats and attacks?
Well, I think that the NIST framework is really a good place to start and a good place to build off of and think through your strategies. But I'll say, so it's identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And I think that overall that we're doing pretty good in the middle parts of that. I think that where we lack the most across the board is on the ends. So the first one, identify, is what I talked about with mission assurance. And I don't think many businesses, even government or public sector, spend enough time and effort and brain power on the identify. You have to know your networks. You have to understand what is on your network. You have to know your data and what's important. You have to understand through your COO what's required in order to continue to operate, your CFO in order to understand whether or not you can continue to operate if your billing systems go down, those kinds of things. So identify what normal looks like on your network and understand who's supposed to have access to what are the normal processes and when do those occur. All of that has to be done up front in order for the next steps to be able to protect, detect, and respond. And then in the recovery part of it, and part of the reason why I appreciate so much what Veritas does and why I wanted to serve on the Public Sector Advisory Board for Veritas is because that whole NIST framework is part of what Veritas supports, and particularly on the recovery side. So understanding when you respond, how quickly can you restore your networks, restore your capability, restore that mission bring it back in order to operate, even while you're still potentially under a ransomware attack. You should be able to restore and recover your network very, very quickly, and practice that and understand what that means for your systems.
It's great to hear you say that, Nancy. And that was something that even I experienced back when I was in the field working for Veritas. We would constantly have conversations with our customers about the importance of rehearsing their recovery strategies as much as it is to have a recovery strategy in the first place, because that's where you find the gaps. That's where you identify what is missing. So it's paramount that preparation be just as important as part of the actual having a strategy to recover and having the ability to recover as well.
That's exactly right. In the military, yes, we drill all the time because you want to be faster and better at doing that, at being able to recover.
And it also, I feel like it's just one of those, when you do those drills, when you go through that process, that's where you identify and highlight where things really can go wrong, or you find missing pieces you never knew about in the first place. And businesses being as big as they are, having as many silos as they can, it's paramount that the identification of these individual silos where teams have gone rogue, or, now that many of us are working from home outside of our home offices, what risks are involved on those endpoint devices, and what are we bringing into the network? So even from the individual perspective, we have to be thoughtful around that NIST framework and how we interact and behave inside of our connected businesses.
That's right. I think that's an area where we as a society, again, not just the United States, but across the world, are still falling short a lot, is understanding what part do we play in being the weakest link at home, on our devices, in the things that we do in our personal lives, and how that could potentially impact the global commons of cyberspace.
Yeah, and it's also just wild to think about the fact I was a victim of a cyber threat myself, and it was completely outside of my own influence. It was a company that failed, and it impacted me personally, but it changed the way that I had to think about cybersecurity as an individual. So, as someone who works for a business, we also have to think about how our interfacing with other businesses impact us, impacting our business. It's just, there's so many layers and so many pieces of connected tissue that we have to think about that we probably don't until it happens. So it's great that we're having this conversation and informing our audience of the importance of these things.
Yeah, well, Anthony, I'm so sorry that you had to go through that, but that is definitely, not uncommon these days to know people who've had their identity stolen or had their networks attacked and their financial, lives disrupted because of that. And I think it's something that we as individuals really do need to take responsibility for and understand, what are we bringing into our lives? What kind of data are we giving away? What kind of applications are we letting have access to, our phones and our computers without even thinking about it? And it's something that I think is really important. I'll flip that around a little bit too, though. I also think that it's a real responsibility for developers to put more time and energy and resources into making those applications and systems secure from the beginning. And, it's the consumer's fault as much as it is the developers, because consumers just want something that's cheap and fast. And so developers play to that, and they don't bother with security. So it isn't built in, but yet there's an assumption from the consumer that, well, it must be secure enough because millions of people are using this app, so it must be okay. And that's just not true. There's inherently a responsibility for both the developers and the consumers to try to ratchet up the level of basic cybersecurity in our systems that we're using every day.
Absolutely agree. You made me think of back when I was an engineer. Back in the old days, we used to joke you had three options: cheap, fast, and good. Pick two. And that, it reverberates even to today. And, I also wanted to just call back to one point you made about the importance of data. And, over time, in marketing, you would see these journals that said data is the new oil. And then it shifted to data becoming the lifeblood. And now data is the target. So we've almost seen these phases of where data was just this intrinsic value to now the thing that people are almost trying to kidnap and hold hostage. So it's very interesting just to kind of be alive in these times where something like data can be ransomed. It's just very interesting to think about, and how we treat it and protect it and create security around it.
That's exactly right, Anthony. But it's so true. The information that we have available to us about us and what we rely on every day is what makes the difference. And so when we as an institution or companies think about protecting the network or protecting the devices, the endpoints, that's in order to protect the data. Yeah. It's not in and of itself enough to be protecting devices, because the devices are just the means to the end. Right. And the data is what really supports the mission. So, so that's why it's important to be thinking on all levels of that, because, you can have a perfectly secure device and still have data that's moving between secure devices in a way that gives some other device access that you don't want, that if you're consciously and readily giving away your data, it doesn't matter that the device is secure.
Absolutely. Yep. And we don't think that way until it's too late too often. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I also just want to make a call out. Our very own Sonia Duffin, who is a ransomware expert here at Veritas, recently published a blog titled "Hackers Are In, Now What?" Great title. Love it, Sonia. Do check that out. If this conversation has sparked interest for you, or you are wondering how secure your data is, highly recommend the read, because she offers some great tips and strategies for dealing with this exact scenario. Now, I know we're running up on time, but Nancy, thank you for being here. Just wanted to see if there were any closing remarks from you or thoughts to go out on.
Well, I will tell your audience that the blog from Sonia is a great one, and she hits on many of the same points that we just talked about, and really has a systematic way of thinking through that. It's a really good place to start if you realize that you're not thinking through the strategy the way you should be for your organization, your company, or your personal life.
Well, so thanks for that. Yes, and thanks for endorsing Sonia's blog. We really appreciate you being here, Vice Admiral Nancy. You have been just a tremendous help, and I hope our audience took a lot away from it. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Anthony. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you. And just to our audience, if you would like to submit a topic for a future episode, let us know in the comments. Use the Veritas Live hashtag and reach out to us on our socials. We want to hear from you, and we're curious about what you'd like to hear about. As always, we'd like to thank you for watching our show, and we will see you next time. Thanks for spending time with us.